In today's video, we are going to break down the 5 common mistakes people make when shooting real estate videos. And while we're at it, we'll also review this Zhone Crane 4E, which might be a great option if you're looking for a gimbal for your real estate filming. So if you don't know, I shoot a lot of interiors for luxury hotels and resorts. And in the last 10 or so years of me doing that, I've picked up quite a few techniques that I can hone in on to ensure that I get the best quality for my clients possible. And a lot of the techniques that I use on these shoots could be applied to any sort of real estate shooting you might be doing as well. So to figure out our 5 common mistakes, let's have a look at this first video showing the sort of bad techniques that we need to avoid when shooting real estate. The first thing you'll notice in there is the fact that it's just not very interesting. It's super wide, you can just see everything all in one go, and you're not really directing the viewer's vision. When I'm doing interiors for luxury hotels, resorts, private islands, villas, that kind of thing, it's all about taking the viewer on a journey. It's all about giving them a sense of what it's going to be like when they're actually there. That doesn't necessarily mean showing absolutely everything all at once. Being selective can really elevate the interior space that you are showcasing. First off, before you really start shooting anything in an interior space, choose an angle. Find an angle that's going to work. Maybe there's some nice depth that you can work with, so you're shooting around something or over something. Or it might just be a case of showcasing the room in such a way that really emphasizes different parts one by one. Remember, you're editing a video here. You don't have to capture all in one big sweeping shot. You can break it up into different areas, and that really helps elevate the overall film. So what makes this gimbal so special then, and what do I really like? Well, without doubt, I think the number one thing with this particular gimbal is its payload capacity. This gimbal can handle up to 4.5 kilograms. I tested out with my red Komodo X and it balanced absolutely fine. One feature I really like on this particular gimbal is the fact that you have a lock mode on here, so that you can basically choose that mode and the gimbal won't change direction no matter what you do. Even if you twist it around, it's gonna stay facing the same direction. When you're doing interiors like this, it is incredibly useful to have that. You can sort of do that with the RS4 by holding down on the trigger and then it stops everything from moving. And I got into the habit now of just really holding onto that trigger all the time. However, if you let go, suddenly the gimbal points in a different direction. The final thing that I'll mention that is really nice about this gimbal, which is a bit different from the Ronin series. Of course, it's got things like the app and it's got camera control, all that sort of thing. But one thing I really like about this particular one is its foot design at the bottom of the battery grip right here. It means you can actually place it down on a surface and it will actually balance. You don't need to be using the tripod legs all of the time. Now, I would be cautious because it is a small footprint and if someone were to slightly knock it, it is going to fall over. But certainly if you need to quickly place it down and you haven't got the tripod legs attached at that particular moment, then it's good that you can actually do that without needing to attach them. The Crane 4 does have some interesting attachments that you can get for it as accessories. A wrist mount, which does actually work. It really does help when you're doing those lower movements. It helps sort of balance out the weight and just gives you an extra point of contact, something a bit different from what I've seen on other gimbals. And then it's got sort of like a tripod handle you can attach to the other side, and it's fully adjustable and you can point in any direction. Both those features work very nice, and I think if you're going for this gimbal, I would be very tempted to pick up as well. You've selected the angle for the shot of the room that looks nice and interesting. Now the next thing you need to think about is what height you need to be shooting at. Another common mistake I often see is that people just shoot too high. They basically shoot at the same height as their eye as they walk around, maybe slightly lower, and they kind of point the camera down on everything. It just makes everything look small. It doesn't look good when you're looking down on all of the space of the room, and it just creates this sense of a small space, even with a really wide angle lens. It's much better to be a bit lower and actually be the same height as the furniture, be amongst the room. Once again, this creates real depth because now suddenly you've got things to go around, but it also just creates a much nicer proportions of everything. So the sofa suddenly looks the right size and the table looks correct, and it just gives you that nice depth and length to everything. So there's a real 3D feel to the space that you just don't get when you're shooting high up looking down. Now the height you pick will depend on what you're shooting. If you're shooting a divan bed, for example, you might need to go a bit higher. If you're doing a sofa, then it may be a bit lower. It will really depend on the furniture in the space and in the room. I already just mentioned it in that one, but the other issue with being too high is you end up not being level, as you need to look down onto the space. And that just looks ugly. It means that all the verticals go out of line, and that just doesn't look good. When you're doing architectural photography, you'll see this all the time. You want nice straight verticals. It makes everything look much more symmetrical. It makes things just look much more professional. And that is something you can apply to your real estate videos as well. This is quite a simple one when using something like a gimbal like this Crane 4E. You can literally set it so that the level is always correct. You don't need to worry about whether or not the camera is level, because you know the gimbal is going to do it for you. So take advantage of that. Make sure that before each shot you reset the gimbal so that it's definitely level and not pointing up or down. Now, although this gimbal works very well as a gimbal and very competitive to anything else out in the market, there are a few things that I do find frustrating with it and might be deal breakers for you. The first one, and I think it's the biggest one for me, this thing can't break down. Other than taking the legs off and removing the cross plate up here, nothing else can be removed. It is one single unit, and that is a big pain when you want to pack it down into a smaller bag, or if you do a lot of traveling. With this one, you're gonna have to get the whole thing out every time you want to charge it up, and you are unable to have a backup battery as well. It is a shame at the top here for the mount, they haven't gone with a Arca Swiss. Unfortunately, they've gone with sort of their own mount that goes on forwards and backwards rather than the side to side that you get with the Arca Swiss. And that's annoying for a couple of reasons. One, it's just not an industry standard. It means you have to use this particular plate right here and attach it to your camera. However, a bigger problem for me is the fact that I use Arca Swiss cages on my cameras. This means I can quickly chuck it on the gimbal or put it onto a tripod or whatever it might be without needing to attach and remove tripod plates. I hate having to do this. I always worry about losing them. And unfortunately, with this particular setup, you just can't do that. Another shame, I think, with the design is the fact that you don't have any NATO attachments at the top of the gimbal. On the Ronins, you'll know, of course, you've got those two attachments either side, and you can whether attach accessories from DJI themselves, or you can attach other bits and pieces onto them using sort of standard NATO rails, which are very common out there. And I like having sort of handles up there to just make things a bit easier when doing gimbal movements. Of course, you do have those attachments at the bottom. However, one frustration with them is the fact that they are not any sort of quick release system. You have to use an Allen key, which I think is a big negative nowadays. I also find that down there it's just a bit in the way of the legs when you've got all those bits attached and not always quite where you want a handle attached. The build quality of this gimbal is absolutely fine. It's made of plastic and some people might see that as a bit of a negative. However, it can also be a positive as well, because I often find that the metal design of the Ronin can sometimes not feel very nice in the hand, especially in hot or cold environments where, you know, suddenly that metal isn't very nice to hold onto. But with the plastic, actually, it feels nicer to hold, I think, than the Ronin. However, I can totally understand people's concern about being a more plasticky design overall. The final thing I'll mention is the price, which might seem a bit weird as this is a very affordable gimbal. But unfortunately, all gimbals are fairly affordable. Whether you go for one of these, whether you go for the full Crane 4, or you look at the competition, all of them are in roughly the same price bracket. So I would argue price isn't really any particular competitive advantage of this gimbal over the other options that are out there. The fourth mistake I see people make with real estate video is the fact that they just shoot on such a wide angle lens. It feels like people just want to go wider and wider all the time. You know, it's whether it's you need to be 16mm, no, you need to be 12mm, no, you need to be 10mm, whatever it may be, it's too wide. There are times when you do need to get the really wide angle lens out, and the ultra wide is the only option, because unfortunately, that's the only way you're going to be able to capture the space the way you need to. However, I'd always think about trying to get on the longest focal length possible. That's how I treat every time I shoot a space. I'm trying to put the longest lens I can on my camera to capture that space. Generally, I'm always aiming to shoot at 24mm. That might seem very, very long for a lot of people who shoot real estate. You might think, really, John, you shoot on a 24mm? And yes, I do. because if I have the space, it's going to create much better depth. It's going to create much more compression, and it just makes the space look much nicer. You're not going to get any weird distortion going around the edges. Now, that's not always possible, and sometimes you do need to go wider to see more, and often I'll sit around 20mm on the 16 to 28mm. However, one thing I really try to avoid is the wide end of that lens. Very rarely do I shoot at 16mm unless I absolutely have to. Like I mentioned with point number 1, by choosing a longer focal length, you can be much more selective about what the audience sees. You can hide parts of the room that perhaps don't look as nice, that perhaps don't represent the feeling of the space, because rooms don't always look good from every single angle. By being a bit more selective, not only by the angle that you choose, but also the focal length, you can really concentrate on where the viewer looks. So who is this particular gimbal for? Well, I think if that locking feature is really important to you and you need the heavy payload, then this is a great option to go with. If you don't mind the fact that you can't pack it down, then you're not going to have any real problems with this particular gimbal. The final point I want to make is about slowing down. Please just slow down as much as possible. Too many real estate videos fly around a house at high speed. Even if they're shooting at 60 frames or something to get that smoother movement with the gimbal, they're still moving incredibly fast as they do so. And it just feels like you're on a roller coaster, which, to be honest, makes no sense from a storytelling perspective. Ultimately, you're still making a film. Okay, it might just be to sell a house, but you're trying to portray what is the feeling of that space, what it's like to actually live there. And you're never going to get that if you're flying around the house at high speed. That isn't what a house is for. People want to relax when they get back to their home or back to their hotel room, whatever it may be. These spaces are meant to be calming and relaxed, in which case we all know from cinematic language that means you need slower camera movements to make that work. Sometimes that might just be a case of sticking it on a tripod. Maybe a still shot is the better way to go. But at the very least, you want to keep your gimbal shots nice and slow and smooth. Often when I'm using the gimbal, it is actually quite small movements. I'm not doing big sort of walking movements across the entire room. In fact, the only time I ever really do that is when I'm in a very large space, when I'm shooting an indoor pool or I'm shooting a large restaurant, something like that. That's the only time really I ever do proper walking with a gimbal. The rest of the time I am doing at most just a couple of steps. Often it's just the movement side to side, and that is more than enough to get, say, a meter or two of parallax movement for the particular shot. And it can just be really slow. Shooting at higher frame rates obviously can massively help with that and help smooth things out. But even then, it's still about just doing a very slow movement left to right to just portray a bit of depth and change of perspective. That's all it needs to be. Maybe it will reveal a bit more of the space to the side so you can move into the next shot. Slower is more elegant, it's calmer, and it just creates much more intention. And it's much easier to get that intention when you're doing slower movements with your gimbal. If you've enjoyed this video and you want to pick one of these gimbals up, then please use the affiliate links down below. Also, while you're down there, make sure you like and subscribe as well. And if you want to watch some more of my content, then here's another video you might be interested in.